This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Welcome to The World Today. I'm Richard Nta in Nairobi. Here's what's ahead. Sudan set to reopen Khartoum Airport on Wednesday as anti-military protests continue in the capital. And outgoing German Chancellor Angela Merkel in caretaker role after 16 years at the helm. Brazil's Senate panel backs criminal charges against President Bolsonaro. Once again, welcome to The World Today. Let's begin in Sudan, where the office of Sudanese Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok says he has returned home. They announced his release Tuesday. Hamdok was arrested a day earlier by the military. The head of the armed forces, Abdel Fattah el-Burhan, says it was done for Hamdok's own protection. Burhan also says the military took control of the government to stop a civil war. The Prime Minister's office says Burhan's actions had nothing to do with the national interest. Meanwhile, the Sudanese Civil Aviation has announced that Khartoum's international airport will reopen on Wednesday. The airport was closed following the ousting of the government by the military.
We want the civil government and are against the military and dictatorial rule. And we will not allow the return of the military rule again to Sudan. But we want a just and democratic civil system that takes into account the interest of the Sudanese people.
We will close the streets until the civil government we want is formed. This is our dear homeland, Sudan, dear to us, and we will not give it up again, and we will not return to military rule again.
Pro-government demonstrators have promised a, quote, march of millions, close quote, on Saturday in continued civil disobedience against the military seizing power in Sudan. Workers at the State Petroleum Company and doctors' unions in the country say they will join nationwide protests called for by trade unions. In opposition, protesters supporting the military began demonstrating over a week ago. They have been calling on armed forces to take control of a shared government that would eventually hand over power to civilian rule. They said the transitional body was unable to tackle economic and political instability. Earlier, we spoke to Naba Muaddin, who gave us an update on the events unfolding in Sudan. Let's take a listen.
The Prime Minister didn't issue any direct comment since he was released, but there is confirmed news that he is staying in his house north of Khartoum in Kafuri and guarded by the military and by police and security also, but he didn't make any comment since he was released. The news said all of the officials right now are in the prison. There is no confirmed news that any one of them he was released, and there is other news that more 3 officials were taken yesterday after they talked to some international media, including Sadiq Sadiq, Faiz Silek, and other officials in the Prime Minister's office. The security situation in the country is not clear yet. The military, police, and security are trying to remove the barricades protesters made to block the access for heavy vehicles and for the pickups of the security and military. But the protesters are putting more barricades. All of the businesses are stopped. People are so worried because the internet is still shut down, and there is no news about any compromisement or any negotiations soon. So now it's a tense time. People are waiting for political solutions and for security solutions and for the international community to interfere.
An emergency UN Security Council meeting on Sudan has ended without a joint statement. It comes as the Secretary General called on world leaders to overcome differences and take action against what he called an epidemic of coups d'etats in Africa and Asia. Sarah Walton reports.
The Security Council met behind closed doors on Tuesday afternoon at the UN headquarters in New York. Members received a briefing from Volker Perthes, the UN's special representative for Sudan, who's currently in Khartoum. Before the meeting, we heard from Norway, one of the countries that called for today's meeting.
We, of course, as Norway, strongly condemned the ongoing military coup in Sudan. And we have called for the immediate release of Prime Minister Hamdok and all other detainees in Sudan.
The military seized power in Sudan on Monday, 2 years after the ousting and arrest of longtime leader Omar al-Bashir. The military was due to hand over leadership of the council that runs the country to civilians in just a few weeks. Earlier on Tuesday, the Secretary-General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, said it was part of a series of coups in Africa and Asia by military leaders taking advantage of geopolitical differences at the UN Security Council and the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic.
My appeal, obviously, is for especially the big powers to come together for the unity of the Security Council in order to make sure that there is effective deterrence in relation to this epidemic of coup d'etats.
After the Security Council meeting came to a close, Russia's representative said there was still work to be done to find common ground amongst the member states.
Let's work on some document and then we'll see what we agree on, okay? We agree on that we are all preoccupied on what's happening in Sudan. That's the most important thing.
The Security Council is due to discuss the situation in Sudan again on Wednesday. Meanwhile, the UN says it's working with partners to provide life-saving assistance to 9 million vulnerable people across Sudan, and that it's critical those operations continue unimpeded to prevent a further deterioration of the humanitarian situation. Sarah Walton, CGTN, New York.
The United Nations said aid delivery in Sudan is currently difficult. The spokesperson of the UN Secretary General, Stephanie Dujarric, says the political unrest has posed a challenge in distributing humanitarian supplies to those in need.
The UN mission in Sudan continues to encourage all of the parties to de-escalate tensions, maintain the constitutional partnership, and advance the political transition under the provisions of the constitutional document. And of course, you all heard and saw what the Secretary General said this morning, calling for the immediate release of all those who have been detained. You know, we have operations throughout Sudan. We've also been issues with some goods being not flowing through Port Sudan as they should be. Obviously, as it is in any case, unrest, military unrest, makes it that much more complicated for us to deliver the aid that we need to deliver to those who need it the most.
Germany's outgoing Chancellor Angela Merkel has received her discharge papers from President Frank-Walter Steinmeier. Steinmeier officially declared Tuesday as the end of Angela Merkel's tenure as Chancellor. He says Merkel's 16 years in office are exemplary and hailed her administration as one of the greatest in German history. Merkel will keep leading a caretaker government until the cabinet is appointed and sworn in. China is hitting back at American officials for making remarks regarding Taiwan that challenge the One China principle. The Chinese embassy in the U.S. says the People's Republic is the only lawful representative of China at the United Nations, and that's based on Resolution 2758, the world body passed in 1971. On Tuesday, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called on countries to support what he calls Taiwan's meaningful participation in the UN. A Chinese government spokesperson urged the U.S. to comply with the UN resolution and the 3 Sino-U.S. joint communiques and stop making any irresponsible remarks. A Brazilian Senate commission has voted to approve a damning report that recommends criminal charges be filed against President Jair Bolsonaro. It includes crimes against humanity for his controversial handling of the government's coronavirus pandemic response. Paulo Cabral has more from Sao Paulo.
O relatório está aprovado por 7 votos a 4.
The approval of the report in the Senate's committee was not a surprise, as most members of the panel had already declared their opposition to Bolsonaro's handling of the pandemic throughout the 6 months of investigations. So the result was 7 votes for the report, 4 votes against the report. In the end, a total of 79 people and 2 companies are being accused of crimes during the pandemic, including President Jair Bolsonaro and 3 of his sons. There are 9 charges against the president, including crimes against humanity, forgery, and charlatanism, this latest one for defending the use of medications against COVID-19 without scientific evidence, such as the hydroxychloroquine. The senators also have called for actions to be taken to ban President Jair Bolsonaro from media networks. This following his claims that last week that there would be a connection between the vaccines against COVID-19 and AIDS. Such statements had already led Facebook, also YouTube and Instagram to suspend the president's accounts. Senator Omar Aziz, who said now this report will be sent to the competent bodies so they can make justice for the Brazilian people. In the case of President Bolsonaro, this means sending the conclusions to the office of the Attorney General. Augusto Aras will then decide himself if he will actually indict the president. And actually, most analysts here in Brazil say that this is unlikely, as he's been appointed by Bolsonaro and is seen as a close ally of the president. So now we have to wait and see. On the other hand, it has already caused him considerable political damage, and yes, it may hinder his possibilities of re-election in next year's presidential elections. Paulo Cabral, CGTN, São Paulo.
The UN warns pledges to cut greenhouse gas emissions put the planet on track for an average rise of 2.7 degrees Celsius this century. Their annual report says updated pledges only reduce projected 2030 emissions by an extra 7.5%. A 30% cut is needed to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius and a 55% cut for 1.5 degrees. Governments are expected to commit to more ambitious pledges at next week's climate conference. Well, China's State Council has released an action to a plan to peak carbon emissions by 2030. Under the plan, the country aims to achieve the world's most dramatic reduction in emissions intensity. It calls for rising the share of non-fossil energy consumption to around 25%. And compared with 2005 levels, the plan would drop carbon emissions per unit of GDP by more than 65%. The goals are in line with the Paris Agreement. China also says it will get involved in global climate governance and build a green belt and road. All right, well, that's it for this edition of The World Today. I'll be back shortly with more news from the continent in Africa Live. Thanks for watching. Stay here on CGTN.
Taken me completely out of my depth, but at the same time it's exciting. It's new, it's different, it's a challenge.
It's really exciting.
Over the last 14 hours of rain.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Sudan to reopen Khartoum Airport Wednesday as Prime Minister Hamdok is returned home after arrest. What does the current standoff between ECOWAS and Mali mean for the country's transition? Enthusiasts in Tanzania's hope to make Bao household board game. Hello and welcome to Africa Live. As always, great to have you with us. Richard Nta live in Nairobi, and for those of you joining us from across the continent and around the globe, we thank you for joining us. Let's take a look at other stories making headlines this hour. In business, South Africa's Sibanye still water to pay $1 billion for its Brazil mine acquisitions. And in sports, South Africa cruised to an 8-wicket win over defending champions West Indies. Once again, welcome to Africa Live. Great to have you along with us for this hour. Let's begin in Sudan, where the office of Sudanese Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok says he has returned home. They announced his release Tuesday. Hamdok was arrested a day earlier by the military. The head of the armed forces, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, says it was done for Hamdok's own protection. Burhan also says the military took control of the government to stop a civil war. The Prime Minister's office says Burhan's actions had nothing to do with the national interest. Meanwhile, the Sudanese Civil Aviation has announced that Khartoum's international airport will reopen on Wednesday. The airport was closed following the ousting of the government by the military.
We want the civil government and are against the military and dictatorial rule. And we will not allow the return of the military rule again to Sudan. But we want a just and democratic civil system that takes into account the interest of the Sudanese people.
We will close the streets until the civil government we want is formed. This is our dear homeland, Sudan, dear to us, and we will not give it up again. And we will not return to military rule again.
Well, earlier we spoke to Naba Muhiddin, who gave us an update on the events unfolding in Sudan. Let's take a listen.
The Prime Minister didn't issue any direct comment since he was released, but there is confirmed news that he's staying in his house north of Khartoum in Darfur and guarded by the military and by police and security also, but he didn't make any comment since he was released. The news said all of the officials right now are in the prison. There is no confirmed news that any one of them he was released, and there is other news that more 3 officials were taken yesterday after they talked to some international media, including Sadiq Sadiq, Faiz Silek, and other officials in the Prime Minister's office. The security situation in the country is not clear yet. The military, police, and security are trying to remove the barricades protesters made to block the access for heavy vehicles and for the pickups of the security and military. But the protesters are putting more barricades. All of the businesses are stopped. People are so worried because the internet is still shut down, and there is no news about any compromisement or any negotiations soon. So now it's a tense time. People are waiting for political solutions and for security solutions and for the international community to interfere.
Now let's bring in Tembisa Fakude, a senior research fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogues. He joins us via Zoom from Johannesburg. Tembisa Fakude, welcome to Africa Live. Thank you for joining us. Help us understand the military's motivation. Tembisa.
Well, the military motivation is to aggregate power. As you know, that the former head of state, Omar al-Bashir, is facing certain very serious challenges at the International Court of Justice and inside Sudan. The 2 leaders of the military, which is one, the former chairperson of the Sovereign Council, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and his deputy, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, were part and parcel of that formation. In other words, they were leading Sudan with al-Bashir. So it stands to reason that if Bashir is to face the music, it would make sense not to have the 2 also follow suit, because they were part and parcel of his regime. But importantly, the most powerful person in the leadership currently, Sovereign Council of Sudan, is Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemeti. And Hemeti was the leader of the Janjaweed. The Janjaweed are the people who are currently accused of having committed atrocities and crimes in Sudan over the years, so particularly in Darfur. So it stands to reason, therefore, that Omar al-Bashir won't be the only one held accountable for all the atrocities that have taken place. And I think this is all about ensuring that they aggregate those power, and in future they can dictate the political trajectory of that country.
Compelling points that you've made there. Now, you have previously stated in an article you wrote for Africa-Asia Dialogues that the role of external actors in Sudan must not be underestimated. Can you tell us more about this?
Well, the main culprit, in inverted commas, is the United Arab Emirates under the leadership of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, which has got an ambition of expanding the Dubai ports world. So in other words, they want to dominate the maritime business around the world. And Sudan is one of those countries that they've been looking at. We know that the UAE has been involved from the beginning with Dagalo, particularly in ensuring that Omar al-Bashir was toppled and replaced by the current system. So they're playing that role, and mainly they're motivated by business. But there's a new entrant in Sudan's political business, and that is Israel. Israel's role in Sudan must also not be underestimated. They've got big ambitions of ensuring that they control the sway, particularly political sway at multilateral platforms. So all of these new players, we have to take into consideration their involvement. And you have Egypt and Ethiopia, of course, because the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam remains a big challenge. So Ethiopia is one of those external players. I'm not quite sure whether they're involved at this time around, but Egypt, Ethiopia, United Arab Emirates, and Israel are those countries that we need to look at moving forward.
All right, Thembisa, in light of all that you said, the external actors and the players, where do you see this current crisis going?
Well, the current crisis is going to go ahead. I mean, we know that Abdel Fattah al-Burhan has mentioned that the elections are likely to take place in July 2023. So we'll have to wait and see. But in the meantime, you have to deal with the pressure that's been exerted at the moment by the northeastern tribes, particularly the six Beja tribes in the northeastern part of Sudan, have continued to disturb the flow of goods into the Sudan hinterland. So that's one. But also we need to remember that there are two protests taking place in Sudan at the moment. One is a pro-civilian government protest, which in other words, want the civilian government to be reinstated as part of the Sovereign Council. And we have the other one that has been calling for the disillusionment of the current Sovereign Council. So those two, I think, are likely to butt heads moving forward, and the politics, or their respective politics, are also likely to determine either the flavor of the current ruling elite, or they might just also encourage the community to protest even further.
All right, Thembisa Fakude, thank you for shedding light on that with your analysis. Much appreciated. Now, today is the deadline given for a special representative of the West African bloc, ECOWAS, to leave Mali. Mali's transitional government ordered the envoy on Monday to leave the country within 72 hours. Foreign Affairs Minister Abdoulaye Diop accused Hamidou Boli of engaging with groups, including politicians and journalists, who undertake activities hostile to the transition. Nevertheless, Diop said Mali remains committed to maintaining good relations with ECOWAS. The bloc has been pressing Mali to respect its commitment to hold presidential and legislative elections next February, following an August 2020 military coup. The interim authorities this week have said they will confirm a date for elections by December. Well, for more of this, we are joined by CGTN correspondent Philly Haas in Abuja, the headquarters of the Western Regional Bloc, ECOWAS. Phil, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us. What's the latest update from Mali on the eviction of the ECOWAS representative, and has he left?
Oh, thanks, Richard. So that information is still very sketchy. Just like you said, the the declaration for the special envoy to leave Mali, actually the deadline elapses today, but we actually do not know if he has left, where exactly he is. We do not even have a response from him about those accusations or allegations about how that his actions are incompatible with his status. But we know that before his deadline elapses, there will definitely have to be a response either from him or the ECOWAS body. But looking at some other times when a foremost politician of the political party which actually led the anti-government protest and culminated into the coup, they actually accused him of being an enemy of the state and working with other bodies to frustrate the transition process. So there will definitely be an investigation that is currently ongoing and discussions, but we're monitoring to get further updates.
All right, Philly Hauser, let's leave it there. Thank you so much for your insight analysis. Thanks for staying on top of that story for us. Time now for a short break. You are watching Africa Live. Here's what's ahead. Uganda confirms hit on passenger bus on Monday was a suicide bombing. And herders in Kenya's northern region pick up rice farming to boost food production.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back. China State Council has released an action plan to peak carbon emissions by 2030. Under the plan, the country aims to achieve the world's most dramatic reduction in emissions intensity. It calls for rising the share of non-fossil energy consumption to around 25%. And compared with 2005 levels, the plan would drop carbon emissions per unit of GDP by more than 65%. The goals are in line with the Paris Agreement. China also says it will get involved in the global climate governance and build a green belt and road. The UN warns pledges to cut greenhouse gas emissions put the planet on track for an average rise of 2.7 degrees Celsius this century. Their annual report says updated pledges only reduce projected 2030 emissions by an extra 7.5%. A 30% cut is needed to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius and a 55% cut for 1.5 degrees. Governments are expected to commit to more ambitious pledges at next week's climate conference. Well, for more on this, we are joined by Joanne Yawich, CEO, National Business Initiative, a voluntary coalition of South African and multinational companies working towards sustainable growth and development. He joins us from Johannesburg. Welcome to Africa Live. Welcome to the program. What does the UN report say about Africa?
Okay, so the UN, I haven't read the UNEP report in any detail. However, I think it's important to recognize that Africa, by region across the world, across all of its continents, has the lowest proportion of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. However, at the same time, the populations across Africa are likely to experience the impacts of climate change in a far worse way than many other parts of the world, partly due to the levels of poverty and a lack of institutional capacity. So while the continent doesn't emit huge amounts of greenhouse gases relative to other continents, it will experience the climate impacts more severely.
Well, the report says a 30% cut is needed to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius. How viable is this proposal?
I think that it would require a huge and much greater level of ambition from probably all countries across the world, but in particular from the developed world and the largest emitters is what in fact it means. And I think it's important to note that the report is also based on only at this point in time, half the countries that are signatories to the UNFCCC have in fact come forward with their increased levels of ambition. So I would also see the report as being something that is intended to urge countries to make greater emission cuts, to be more clear about precisely what they mean, to have an earlier start, and to set out a set of much more concrete actions. So that is the way that I understand it. Yes, at the moment, we are not on track to meet either a 2-degree or a 1.5 degree target. But I think the possibilities are there depending on levels of ambition from the biggest emitters.
All right, Joanne Yawich, thank you for speaking to us. Thank you so much again for your insight and analysis. Much appreciated. Northern Kenya is largely hot and dry. Many there are pastoralists due to the harsh climatic conditions. A drought in the region has made the situation worse as many families have lost their livestock due to lack of pasture and water. Now, a group of herders have joined hands to start growing rice, a venture many doubted would be feasible. CGTN's Nick Mudima reports.
Rice farming usually thrives in swampy areas. That's why the idea of rice production in Kenya's arid lands has always raised more than just a few skeptical eyebrows. Not for these residents of Jarajara, a town about 100 kilometers from Kenya's Garissa town. They are livestock keepers, but they came together to take on a project that, from the look of things, now looks to be doing well. The farm is located on the floodplains of the River Tana, which is the longest in Kenya.
Before starting this rice plantation, we used to grow different types of crops like maize, onions, tomatoes, as well as other crops. But due to so many reasons, like frequent human-wildlife conflicts, we decided to try growing rice. We used canals that were made by the British colonialists back in the days to irrigate this farm, but they are now very old. Through our efforts, we've managed to keep them running so that we can be able to feed our families.
At times like such difficult dry days, the river doesn't serve us as required. We also compete for the water with pastoralists. They use water directly from our canals, which affects our consistent water supply.
These families are, however, not the first to grow rice in the area. On those very plots, their fathers used to do the same in the 1980s. But the scheme collapsed in the early 90s. Now, the community has identified rice farming as a viable income-generating venture that will also reduce the dependency on livestock keeping. They have received training on crop management and business development and are looking forward to better days ahead.
This rice plantation sits on a 42-acre piece of land, but the farmers here have one major challenge. Wild animals attack them at night for both water for irrigation and, without a doubt, the rice.
Their milling machines are now quite old, and some have totally broken down. Only one is functioning and thus affecting the processing of their harvest. They harvest twice a year, and each farmer is assured at least 30 bags of rice.
We're just using this old machine to mill our rice. We're competing with the big names out there, and our hope is that one day we'll get a modern milling machine because these ones break down easily.
The rice farmers still have big dreams, despite the drought that has hit the area. Nothing goes to waste here. What remains after the harvest and milling is used as animal feed. Theirs is a story of resilience and courage amidst adversity. Nick Mudimba, CGTN, Garissa County, Kenya.
Uganda police has confirmed that Monday's bomb attack on a bus was a suicide bombing. Authorities say the rebel group, the Allied Democratic Forces, is responsible. Leon Sinyenge brings us more details.
The passenger bus was the target of a bomb attack that killed at least one person and injured another. 50 other passengers were lucky to survive. The bus had moved about 34 kilometers out of the capital Kampala and was headed for western Uganda. Authorities say the bomb was detonated by a passenger on board.
This is the first incident where a suicide operative concealed a suicide vest and belt and detonated it on a bus. The facts that we've also obtained do indicate that the attacker was initially in company of another suspected terrorist.
The bus that was hit left this bus terminal in Kampala. The terminal remains busy even amid the security threat. More security wardens have been deployed at entry points of bus terminals across the city. It's one where the police say can prevent any other bus attack. However, travelers are still enveloped in shock. Some worried about what might be if they travel.
We are waiting for the buses. There are few now, but all is not well. We are not sure how the bombing happened. We previously did not have these things. We are scared.
Business has been affected because people are afraid to travel after what happened.
The bus attack was the second bombing in Uganda in 3 days. One person had earlier been killed and 3 others injured in an attack at an eatery on the outskirts of the capital. Authorities have linked the attacks to the Allied Democratic Forces rebel group. Security experts say the events could be a growing terrorism problem.
What we are worried about is not even the weapons they are using, but the ideology which has now visited us, that vicious ideology which is not about riches, but which is just for destruction.
The attacks come days after the United Kingdom issued a warning that terrorists could strike in the country. Uganda suffered a major terrorism attack by Al-Shabaab back in July 2010. At least 70 people lost their lives and dozens injured in 2 explosions at a rugby club and an Ethiopian restaurant. Leon Sanyange, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Uganda State Minister of Foreign Affairs Henry Oryem Okello has praised China for its demonstration of multilateralism and for its significant contributions at the United Nations. China is celebrating 50 years at the UN. Speaking to CGTN, Okello congratulated Chinese President Xi Jinping's leadership in fighting COVID-19, climate change response, boosting the world economy, as well as solving global development imbalances.
China has always been a part of multilateralism. They continue to practice multilateralism both in their own region and beyond their region and at the United Nations. China is today the one single country that has moved a big population of its people out of poverty. If you talk of participation in the big part of the international community and part of the peacekeeping force, China contributed until recently. China was even in part of Africa making contributions to peacekeeping. We are happy that China has no form of discrimination and extended its love to Africa, particularly at this time when we are fighting the pandemic of COVID. And they have managed to not only supply their vaccines around the world.
Bao, or board in Swahili, is a traditional board game commonly played in Eastern African countries like Tanzania, Kenya, and the Comores. Bao is a 2-player turn-based strategy game. Its complexity and strategic depth has raised interest in scholars of several disciplines, including game theory, complexity theory, and psychology. CGTN's Isaac Lukando finds out more about the game. Let's take a look.
Bao, a chess-like board game, has been at the center of Swahili culture for centuries. Mainly played by Tanzania's coastal communities, 115 of Tanzania's 120 tribes are said to play some form of this game. Monday Likwepa, chairman of the Tanzania Bao Association, argues variations of the game are also played across Africa.
In Nigeria, they call this game a mandala. In Ghana, they call it amankwa. Go to Rwanda, the game is called ingesolo. And if you go to Kenya, it's called ajua. This means that the game is African, but we're not sure how and when exactly it started.
The game is played by 2 people on either side of a 32-hole board divided into 4 rows. Armed with 32 seeds each, a player seeks to leave his opponent without seeds in his inner row through a series of moves, rendering the opponent immobile.
A bow player thinks deeply, thinking about the day before yesterday, today, and tomorrow. By this, I mean that the game has patterns. With proper administration, it can help mold many professionals in the nation.
Tanzania's founding father, Julius Nyerere, an avid player of the game, had ambitions to spread it to China and the rest of the world. As proof, Likwepa claims he possesses the only photograph in existence of Tanzania's founding father explaining the rules of the game to his then Chinese counterpart, Mao Zedong.
Bao has been passed on from generation to generation here in East Africa. Players argue the popular board game serves to improve their strategy setting and problem-solving skills.
The complexity and depth of strategy involved in playing Bao have over the years caught the attention of various scholars. Players in Tanzania say the game has numerous benefits.
What attracts you to the game is the trash talk. While said in jest, the words are part of the game strategy.
Those that dodge math in class and come to play Bao find the subject quite common here. They discover that math is not as hard as perceived. If the game is taught in schools, it will be beneficial.
Bao has already been approved to be taught in Tanzanian schools, while active clubs can be found in countries like Italy, Germany and Brazil. The Tanzania Bao Association says its next challenge is to see the game played at the Commonwealth Games and ultimately popularized around the world. Isaac Lukando, CGTN, Dar es Salaam.
Well, it's time now for our business segment. Here's what's ahead. In business, South Africa's Sibanye Stillwater to pay $1 billion for its Brazil mine acquisitions. And the Naira gets a warm welcome in the second largest market for crypto trading. Welcome back to Africa Live. Thanks for staying with us. South Africa's Sibanye Stillwater has agreed to pay $1 billion in cash for nickel and copper mines in Brazil in a deal that highlights the race to supply battery metals to the booming electric vehicle sector. Flush with cash from a rally in the rhodium and palladium mines in South Africa and Montana in the U.S., Sibanye has joined the push into battery metals. CEO Neil Froneman has already acquired lithium assets in Europe and the U.S. this year. Sibanye climbed as much as 3.9% in Johannesburg trading after dropping 5.1% on Monday when the company said it was in talks to buy the mines. Central banks around the world are now producing their own digital currencies. You'll remember that Nigeria is the latest to do so in a groundbreaking move for the African continent. The country has launched its digital currency, the Naira, amid growing local and global demand for cryptocurrencies. Nigeria joins 14 other countries now in the pilot stages with their own central bank digital currencies. Kelechi Mekalam brings us some reactions from Nigeria.
We have become the first country in Africa and one of the first in the world to introduce a digital currency to her citizens.
A landmark moment for Nigeria as President Muhammadu Buhari unveils its digital currency, the Naira. It's a huge turn from the country's central bank's stance in February banning all cryptocurrency transactions. Authorities now see it as a profitable venture.
Some estimates indicate that the adoption of central bank digital currencies and its underlying technology, called blockchain, can increase Nigeria's GDP by 29 billion United States dollars over the next 10 years.
and it seems to be raising the much-desired interest from several quarters.
33 banks are fully integrated and live on the platform. 500 million naira has been successfully minted by the CBN. 200 million naira has been issued to financial institutions. 4, over 2,000 customers have been onboarded on the platform, and 5, over 120 merchants have successfully registered on the e-platform.
Cryptocurrencies are popular in Nigeria. In 2020, leading Bitcoin marketplace Paxful placed Nigeria as second world's Bitcoin market after the US. However, many Nigerians still have reservations about the country's new digital currency.
And I think the challenge now will be improving our internet space, because we don't have good internet infrastructure in Nigeria.
I'm not quite sure I trust the space enough, because we've heard instances of hacking and things like that, but yeah, it could still be a really good idea in the long haul. So
central banks around the world are working to create digital versions of their legal tenders. China was the first country to launch a test version of its digital currency. 5 others have followed suit since then. Nigeria's government says the e-naira would improve cross-border trade, boost financial inclusion for people outside the formal economy, and increase remittances. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
As world leaders get ready to attend the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, South Africa's Eskom has become the world's largest single emitter of sulfur dioxide, nearly outstripping the entire power sector emissions of any country in the world, excluding India. And that's according to a study by the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. So is the country ready to meet the emission reduction commitments? Angela Coppola has the story.
Some questions have been raised about whether South Africa has everything in place, from a policy, legislation and regulatory perspective, to deliver on its emission targets.
I don't think we do. I think that the President certainly has got a vision around this. We've made some astoundingly large commitments that will be delivered in Glasgow next week. To my mind, they are purely aspirational. And the big challenge there is going to be in integrating that vision across some fairly complex ministries, from the presidency to energy to environment to finance and so on.
There is some policy in place and a regulatory framework managed by the National Electricity Regulator aimed at monitoring the energy environment. However, one area still lacking is national standards for carbon offset schemes that allow companies to invest in environmental projects so that they can balance out their own carbon footprints.
It's very, very important for us at the moment. We are still subject to international standards, which are sometimes expensive and time-consuming to get through the various hurdles.
There's another challenge facing the country, according to Kramer.
The energy ministry is very much behind the coal industry, and while it talks about other additional forms of power, there isn't an upstream exploration bill adequately in place yet. We've done precious little to connect renewables to the grid, and then we've got the financing challenges.
The country's mineral and energy minister sees coal being used for several more years, and any move away to other energy sources has to ensure that local communities near coal mines aren't negatively affected. The so-called just transition. Cabinet generally agrees with this approach, while at the same time it recently set more ambitious emission targets.
We've been hearing mixed messages from our politicians about wanting to reach a net zero goal, but possibly hanging along a bit longer onto coal as a fuel source. So we need to have a uniform message.
The just transition is going to require policy certainty, and it's got to happen quite quickly so that we don't fall further behind. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
And we are not done just yet. We've got your sports news coming up after the break. Here's a look at the headlines. In sports, South Africa